After the murder of Julius Caesar, Rome fractured. By 31 BC, two worlds faced each other: Octavian in Rome, the aspiring restorer of order, and Marcus Antonius in the east, Caesar's veteran lieutenant, bound now to Cleopatra VII, Pharaoh of Egypt. The seat of power was not only the Forum's rostra, but the marble terraces of Alexandria, where Greek columns met Nile light. The stakes were sovereign and intimate. The future of Rome's laws and lineage, the survival of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the wealth of Mediterranean trade, and the reputations of those who would shape the next century. Some say Antony's devotion to Cleopatra was betrayal, of Rome, of reason. Others say it was a final refusal to worship only power. What survives are papyri, coins, marble portraits, and the hush of an antechamber where a water clock dripped the seconds of an age to its brink. Mourning in Alexandria did not ring a brass bell so much as whisper through stone. In the palace on the loftiest promontory, a water clock bled time bead by bead into a bronze bowl, and light climbed the columns like a climber wearily ascending a ladder. Attendants swept limestone dust from thresholds. A scribe lifted a reed pen and blew gently on the split to soften it. Somewhere in the temple quarter, a sistrum rattled, and from a harbor tower, a lantern flame guttered out in the reliable way of dawn. Cleopatra VII, daughter of the line of Ptolemy, woke not as the caricature of later centuries, but as a ruler with a ledger. Grain counted, ships outfitted, priests consulted. Her diadem lay curved like a simple question on the table beside a polished silver mirror. She would bind it to her hair only when the first petitions were ready. In the courtyard beyond, doves beat their wings and lifted a thin, secular breeze. She surrounded herself not with flattery alone, but with instruments. A fan of peacock feathers used to shield the sun while reading an ivory writing board, rubbed smooth by thought a small casket of seals with carved gods and letters. Her voice, ancient writers say, could turn from Greek to Egyptian to Latin without losing its heat. Marcus Antonius entered her world as a soldier enters a house of music. Awkward for a moment, then unexpectedly changed by the sound. He had a veteran's gait, the weight of the triumvirate's oath in his shoulders, and a Roman signet ring engraved with Hercules, the hero he favored as ancestor and emblem. In public, he was all blunt iron. His speeches, his scarred cheek, his laugh that filled a hall. In private, he set the ring carefully on the edge of a papyrus, as if it could teach him to be precise. He had married Octavia, sister to Octavian, to bind an uneasy peace. Yet here in the East, with Cleopatra, he allowed himself a different grammar, of feasts that were also councils, of maps that served as tablecloths, of nights when a sealed letter mattered more than a parade. The palace had its rituals, and they were governance. Every morning brought the counting of ships. The harbor master's ledger, papyrus stiff with salt air, recorded hulls from Cyprus and Rhodes, from Crete and the Black Sea. The steward of the granaries in the Heptastadion sent his note. How many measures of wheat would leave tomorrow under guard for island cities that still paid Egypt homage? A priest of Isis, linen gleaming white, crossed an inner court and paused in the shade, where a young woman, an enslaved person born in the house and trained to handle sacred oils, waited with a folded linen glove to take the warmed libation jar. The priest's eyes met hers. He nodded. Power here was ritual, and also breath. Cleopatra and Antony played their parts under the gaze of the world. They were patrons and sovereigns, mother and father. On days of ceremony, she wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, paired with Greek pearls. He stood in the Roman commander's cloak, red only in the dyer's vats, and in those who looked too hard for blood. Between them moved the signs of a life that was neither solely love nor solely treaty. The toy chariot carved for little Alexander Helios. The necklace strung with a tiny portrait of Cleopatra Selene, the sealed letter addressed to the commander in Cyrene, asking for cavalry mounts that could endure heat. Public faces rarely hold when rooms are small. In her library, under lamps that smelled faintly of oil and smoke, Cleopatra took Antony's hand and set a papyrus beneath it, a reckoning of what it would take to stand against Rome's appetite. It was not poetry. It was columns of numbers turned requests, ships to be scraped, and new crews recruited. Staterae to pay veterans who would follow Antony wherever he went, so long as their families in Italy were not forgotten. He traced the columns with a finger, and she watched him learn the cost of a promise. Beyond their private arithmetic lay the larger account. Roman law had married Antony to Octavia. Roman religion bound him through vows made beneath Italian skies. Yet here was a queen with whom he had children, and here was a religion of the Nile that called her goddess. In Rome, this was read as hubris, the queen as sorcerer, lovers as inimitable revelers. In Alexandria, it was politics. To crown a son as king of Armenia was to signal to the eastern nobility that new alliances would secure their borderlands. To name Caesarion, who many believed to be Julius Caesar's child, as co-ruler was to contest the fragile legitimacy of Octavian, who called himself the son of a god by adoption and law. Between legal title and blood, a seam tore. Rumor hung about this seam like a veil. It was said that Antony called Cleopatra his wife in public ceremonies, though Roman law could not recognize such a union while Octavia lived. It is disputed. It was said, too, that Octavia came to him bearing supplies and loyalty, and was turned away at a gate in Athens or in a port in Greece, depending on who tells it. The stories are shaped for moral tales. The record is narrower and cooler. Envoys went and came. Offerings of peace could not paper over fractures of ambition. An empire is not a household, and a household can become a battlefield. In this palace routine, the fan and the ring began to answer one another. She held the fan against the lamp as heat, as he finished a letter to a centurion he trusted, the wax softening under the bronze seal ring in his hand. They both listened for a sound that meant life under oath still worked. Not the roar of a crowd, but the smaller assurances, steps of a messenger who knew which door to knock upon, the discreet cough of a steward who could recite inventories without prompting, a child's laugh in the next room. The specter at the edge of each sound had a Latin name, Imperium. It demanded every vow wage tribute to its consistency. There were mirrors here, polished silver, not just for vanity, but for reckoning. Did Antony see in this mirror a Roman general who happened to love a queen, or a man whose love had become the ember that would set his banners alight? Did Cleopatra see a queen who had learned to make the Roman world speak in the accents of the Nile, or a woman about to watch her dynasty end because she chose a man who could not unbind himself from the oaths that made him? They did not speak these questions aloud. They were already speaking them by what they did at noon and at midnight. And at noon that year, 31 BC, something shifted. From the harbor terrace, the purple sail that had hung idly began to lift. Messengers shouted quietly, the paradox of a palace. Urgency is always whispered. A sealed letter arrived from a captain near Actium with the report that Octavian's admiral, the seasoned Agrippa, had taken island harbors, cutting Antony's scouts from their routes. Antony took the letter, warmed the wax with his thumb, the sign of a man who has sealed too many to wait, and opened it. He did not look at Cleopatra first. He looked at the map that lay beneath the plate of figs, the ink rivers blue as older blood. He had chosen the East. It was choosing him back, with consequence. Whispers are the true currency of courts. In Alexandria, they traveled by water. A skiff changed course near Pharos Lighthouse at an hour when no one should have rowed. A messenger's litter turned not toward the palace gates, but to a private door beneath a stair where the stone kept cool even in summer. A Greek scribe, his fingers ink-stained, recorded that a papyrus roll carried at sunset was returned at night with a different seal. Was the ring misstruck, or had the wax blurred in the heat? He made a note in the margin, a tiny fish, because in Greek his queen's name sounded like water. He rubbed it out when a sandal scraped nearby. On the terrace, music became signal. The inimitable livers, the festive society that Cleopatra and Antony had formed years earlier, where banquets were both art and policy, hosted gatherings whose invitations traveled like edicts. But now, a shift. Platters arrived covered not with sweets only, but with packets wrapped in linen, ledgers to be signed, orders for victuals, a list of ships needing pitch and rope. Antony had always blurred war and feast, soldiering and spectacle. That was his danger and his gift. The attendants who had learned to move trays of grapes also learned to carry messages sealed with the image of Heracles. They did not read. They did notice whose hands shook under the weight. Rumor from Rome arrived like heat. Octavian, it was said, had obtained Antony's will from the sacred custody of the Vestal Virgins and read it in the Senate. The will allegedly asked for Cleopatra's children to inherit lands beyond Roman law, and for Antony's burial at Alexandria, not Rome. Truth? A rumor preserved in Roman writers. Even if a document lay on that Roman desk, was its text as read? Historians argue, and we will not manufacture certainty where only political theater stand. But the story itself worked like an edict. Listeners found in it what they needed. Confirmation that Antony's heart had left Italy, that Cleopatra's arms were a dragnet drawing Rome to ruin, or, contrariwise, that Octavian used religion's door to haul out private paper for public fury. Back in Alexandria, another small thing, a pair of gloves misplaced in a corridor. Linen, faintly perfumed, they belonged to a woman known for entering rooms no one noticed, her name omitted by every grand chronicler, a palace chamberlain's assistant, born free but bound now by the 1,000 invisible threads of service. She went searching for the gloves. When she found them near the office of the chief treasurer, the door was closed, a lamp smoked from within, and voices murmured, one quick, one slow. She slid the gloves on, gathered what she could see without staring. The treasurer's bronze key lay turned not fully to lock, but to pause. Pause is when decisions balance. She withdrew. An envoy from Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, arrived with packages. It is said that she sent ships with clothing, grain, and money to her husband's army, a gesture of both concern and claim. It is said he refused them, or accepted, and then sent her away. Accounts disagree as courtesies do, and memory is an archer who shoots for virtue or for blame. What is certain is that Antony announced a repudiation of Octavia. In Rome, that sounded like personal insult and political declaration at once. In Alexandria, the words fell somewhere between relief and dread. You cannot have peace between Rome's houses when the bridge is burned on a sentence. Ships creaked under new weight. Cleopatra opened her treasuries. Not a romantic gesture, merely the only gesture possible. She underwrote pay for oarsmen, some free, some enslaved, who trained while the heat clung to their necks and salt stung their eyes. She ordered carpenters to strip ornament from royal barges to refit war galleys with lengths of wood straight enough to bear strain. In the counting rooms, papyrus curled at the corners, and the chief clerk inked a simple phrase at the top of a fresh sheet. For the sea. The words did not shiver. Hands did. At the harbor wall, a diversion one morning glinted and was gone. A small, unremarkable merchant ship changed flags on its mast twice before noon. To a fisherman gutting his catch, this was nothing. To the harbor captain, it was message. Antony's scouts had learned to read not just words, but water, and in an inner courtyard, Cleopatra recorded on a wax tablet the names of households that would require protection if battle turned sour. She was a queen who remembered legal names, and also the intimate ones by which crying children are soothed. Ambiguity hardened. Was this simply war between two Roman claimants, Antony against Octavian, each drawing east and west into their gravity? Or was Antony now king of an eastern kingdom in all but name, his children marked as monarchs of lands Rome would not willingly yield? Cleopatra did not need counsel to know how Romans would tell this story in generations to come. She placed a diadem on Caesarion ES' brow and understood that it could be read as a mother, S hope, or a threat. The line between gift and affront is drawn by the listener's need. Within this swirl, small errors multiply their cost. A letter intended for a captain in the Ionian was misdelivered to a centurion in Cyrenaica. 2 names alike enough to confuse a rushed scribe. The centurion, loyal but wary, brought the sealed papyrus to Antony's staff without breaking the wax. The seal bore Hercules, but the ring had impressed soft, and the image was muddled. The staff hesitated, opened it at last in the general's presence, and found not treachery, but a list of sailors' pay. Nothing, and yet everything. In war, even a pause is chargeable as suspicion. The man who had miscopied the address was dismissed, kindly but firmly. He left the palace with his reed pens wrapped in cloth, and later would tell his grandchildren he had once served a queen who spoke like water. Propaganda is a gale, whispers are currents. Octavian's letters multiplied, framed with Roman gravity. Cleopatra's answered with Egyptian icon and Greek charm. Priests in Rome thundered about foreign rites and debauched splendor. Priests in Alexandria burned incense and asked Isis to remember how often empires stand when kings and queens kneel. Soldiers cared about more immediate rituals: bread, pay, orders that made sense, and leaders who looked at them not as counters on a board, but as men with names. Antony could do that. So could Cleopatra. That was their strength and their failing. People follow those who see them, and when they follow, they bind you to consequences. Night, and the palace seemed to shift its bones. The lanterns of the inner rooms were hooded. The harbor lamps burned steady, measured by water and habit. A messenger from the fleet, dust and salt in his beard, was led through courtyards by a way that avoided crowds. In a small room where a carpet softened the stone, Antony and Cleopatra sat opposite each other as if their chairs balanced scales. The message was simple and terrible. The narrow water near Actium could be a snare. Agrippa's sailors, seasoned by years and loyal as dogs, had chained the geography to their will. Antony's captains urged a land fight. His ships were heavy. His troops still feared more on ground than on deck. Cleopatra's counsel, backed by the arithmetic of treasure and the promise of speed, bent toward the sea. She could furnish ships to break a line, to flee with what must be saved if hope failed. Between pride and prudence lay wax still warm. Antony took his signet ring and hesitated. He could countermand. He could insist on a march inland, abandon the waiting ships, risk the fatigue of dust and thirst, and gamble on the old language of legions and standards. Or he could choose a navy's grammar and accept that a queen, by offering treasure and hulls, would also command a share in the sentence. He looked to her. She did not plead. She placed on the table a small amulet case, no larger than a thumb, that held a coil of a child's hair, Alexander Helios cut when fevers came and went one winter. It was not manipulation. It was reminder. The empire was not abstract. It had faces, handprints on clay tiles, and a nursery bell that chimed when the wind moved through the corridor. He pressed the ring into wax. Orders went out sealed, the seals dried, and the seals were carried into dark. The general and the queen did not embrace the way later painters would imagine. Antony rubbed a thumb against the bronze and left a faint smear on the papyrus where a clean line should have been. He had sealed so much. He had unsealed less. The mistake came small, like a flaw in thread that only shows when the garment is tugged. A lamp was left burning in a window that looked toward the inner harbor. It was a signal, unintended, seen by a captain with a habit of reading lights as messages. He altered course. In the confusion of departure, when Cleopatra's ships raised their purple sails, and a hush fell over decks that usually creaked and sang, this one captain turned a fraction too soon, misaligning his squadron. A messenger corrected the course with hand and shout. It cost minutes. Minutes are nothing until they are everything. At Actium, morning came across a narrow world of water and shore. The sound was rope against wood, oars dipping like many clocks. The Roman onshore watched smoke rise from campfires, smelled the sour of men who had slept in dust, and said their prayers to household gods far away. On Cleopatra's flagship, the decks were washed. The purple sail hung ready, the symbol that could be read as triumph or as target. Antony paced a stretch of planks until the grain in the wood seemed like a road. He listened, as generals do, for the thing one cannot hear, which is the story anyone will tell of this day when it is done. Words fail here on purpose. Let the violence be implied by silence and by faces turned quickly and then away. Ships moved. Orders, blown off course, landed against ears and did or did not transform into action. There was confusion, and there was fear. There was also courage, the quiet kind, when a man stays at his oar because the man beside him has not moved. In the Gulf's haze, Cleopatra's ships made a decision shared by commander and queen. Break out. The sails rose, purple opening like a bruise, and the flagship slipped through a gap where Octavian's line was thinner, whether by skill or by providence. Antony saw it happen. Here is the rumor told as condemnation, that Antony, seeing her go, followed like a shadow, abandoning men to their fate for the sake of a woman's wake. Here is the counter, that Antony's plan had always included this breakout, that treasure needed saving to fight another day, that the fleet was already unwinnable, pressed tight against a coast held by enemies, that to preserve an army, you sometimes must lose a battle. The sources argue as men do when they suffer. It is possible both versions hold parts of truth. Antony leapt to a smaller ship and gave his course to the wind in her sail. At the stern, a sailor looked back at water boiling with oars and whispered a god's name. On the way south, the sea tested the resolve of those who had decided in lamplight. Cleopatra's captain kept the flagship steady, the purple sail eating sunlight. Antony's ship fell into her wake. Between them passed signals, cloth held aloft, a lantern shielded, then flashed, the old maritime grammar. A Roman watchman on a headland recorded that the queen's ships ran not in panic, but in order. Records written in anger later insist they fled. Language is a tool. It obeys the hand that wields it. Aboard ships left in the Gulf, men watched their standards bearer lower his pole and sit. He was not killed. He simply sat. Others sat with him. The battle collapsed like a tent struck too fast. Reports say Agrippa and Octavian won decisively. That is true. Reports say Antony's men surrendered in droves. That may be true, or it may be the language of winners, instructed by necessity to pronounce clarity where fog had reigned. On a beach, a boy new to war bent to pick up a ring someone had dropped, a plain bronze band. He slipped it on his finger, and later, when asked, swore he had seen Antony's ring roll across planks and into foam. It is a story like many. Rings enter history and leave it, on the hands of those who do not know we are watching. The ships that fled found blue water. The decision sealed in night had become a road in day. In the cabin, Cleopatra touched the amulet case and the coil of hair within. Antony stood by the door where the light module shifted with the ship's sway. He felt old, and he felt alive, and he felt the weight of all the men who had looked to him for the kind of victory that would send letters home and not men. He put his hand on the latch and did not open it. A key on a cord swung gently with the motion of the sea. After the harbor smoke, the ledgers, Alexandria received its fugitives with a kind of exhausted courtesy. The harbor master wrote new entries in a steady hand. Ships in, men ashore, stores issued. He knew that history would make film of this, if they had film, but his job was quantities. Cleopatra met with treasurers and captains and priests in rooms that had been designed for poetry readings, and now held maps on every flat surface. The temple corridors filled with incense, and the old questions came to bear. When the gods judge rulers, which altar measures the weight of love against the weight of loss? The Roman world called this day betrayal. Octavian's letters, shaped by efficient scribes and honed by the new truths, Any victory offers said clearly that Antony had dissolved into foreign fever, that Cleopatra, foreign queen, had lured him to abandon duty, that Rome must defend itself not only against enemies, but against enchantment. The charge was moral and political. It was also convenient. He, Octavian, had to craft a Rome that would forgive civil blood by agreeing on a villainy it could describe as external. Cleopatra obliged that narrative by simply existing in Alexandria and not in Rome. Antony obliged by refusing to come home under conditions that would have clothed his return in humiliation. Inside the palace, the trial was gentler and harder. Cleopatra and Antony asked each other the questions of those who still love when chance has turned. In a cooled room, they sat on low chairs and spoke over cups of water with mint. He asked if he had followed too quickly. She asked if she had urged him too ardently. Between them lay a sealed letter that had not yet been opened, a report from a friend near Peloponnese. Neither reached for it. Love is sometimes refusing to require immediate absolution. Proofs refuse to settle. The donations of Alexandria, where years earlier in 34 BC Antony and Cleopatra had publicly arrayed their children and titled them kings of lands beyond Egypt, were brought out again as Exhibit A in Rome, as new trial of hearts. Plutarch, writing later, calls it spectacle and provocation. But the record in Alexandria shows ledger entries for gifts given to local nobles at that ceremony so that they would pledge their households. The politics of family and obligation require theater as much as treaty. What was the donations day truly? A mother ensuring her children within a world that recognized crowns more quickly than letters patent? Or a lover's boast that he could redraw maps with love? The answer shifts with a reader's loyalty. Priests moved in corridors, linen hissing. A young acolyte, an enslaved man freed the year before by a gift from a grateful matron, now carried a lamp before a procession to the chapel where queens had spoken to gods. He had learned to notice the lay of the palace. Which stones had been smoothed by sandals, which doors opened onto noise, which onto quiet. He paused outside a small door because he heard voices, low. It was Cleopatra and a tutor from the library, arguing gently about language, whether the Greek word for honor, time, could hold what Rome meant by dignitas. He stood a moment longer than was proper because the words soothed him. He would never have dignity by Rome's laws. But in this corridor, listening, he had the dignity of a witness to thought. Antony's soldiers still with him in Alexandria were asked to pledge again. Some did easily, others with a tiredness that looked like refusal, but was simply grief. One veteran put his hand to the bronze of his helmet crest and said, "I have worn this too long to pretend the world is simple." He went where he was told, by a man he had decided still loved him. That is not a small thing. The gossip in Rome turned this into derision. Men bewitched. The truth in Alexandria was that loyalty can be the least political motive and the most costly. Octavia's name surfaced like a well-cleaned wound. She had not spoken loud in any of this, and in that lay her steadiness. Rumor said she sent a letter that never arrived. A clerk in Athens logged a sealed letter for a vessel bound for Crete, then crossed out the line and wrote, "Delayed." Was that her paper? A rumor preserved in one clerk's note. Even if it were, did anyone open it in time? In a story of ships and armies, a letter that never arrived can feel small. It is not. Letters are the places where mercy sometimes lives. Without them, decisions harden. A parlor confrontation, remembered or imagined, unfolded in the accounts of those who wrote later. A Roman emissary, perhaps invented by a memoirist, stood opposite Cleopatra and told her to release Antony back to Roman duty. She placed her fan on a table. She did not shout. She asked what duty did not include honoring the mother of one's children, and what law of Rome required a queen to unmake her own household, to lift a man back to a dignity Rome would soon strip him of anyway. The emissary muttered about tradition, and she answered with the oldest tradition. Those who build families build states. He left, or he never came. The point is, the argument remains. Ledgers collided with rumor. Grain tallies declined as ships were requisitioned for war, and market women in Rakotis grumbled that the queen loved soldiers more than bakers. Pamphlets, in Greek and in Latin, copied in scriptoriums and traded in baths, said the worst of her in words that have harmed women who lead in every century. We do not repeat them. The palace turned inward. The children's tutor taught them the constellations, tracing with a fingertip the small cranes and the great boat. Cleopatra watched and saw not stars but a map of what was left to steer by. And yet, responsibilities blur. Cleopatra was sovereign. Her choices had public cost. Antony was commander. His love had public consequence. Neither could pretend their tenderness existed in a private garden. When they returned to their rooms at night, and a key turned in a lock, the old sound of privacy, they did not exclude the world. They only changed its volume. That makes forgiveness both more necessary and more difficult. You forgive the part of the person who could not do anything different and still be themselves. That is a trial, longer and less conclusive than any Senate vote. Exile does not always require distance. Sometimes it is a shrinking of space until a palace becomes a bedchamber, and a bedchamber becomes the span between a lamp and a door. After Actium, Rome's tide was relentless. In 30 BC, a year folded so tightly into 31 that memory barely separates them, Octavian came to Egypt. Alexandria, the city that had taught the world to measure stars and preserve books, learned the taste of submission. There were no public trials for Cleopatra and Antony. The trial had already taken place in pamphlets and rumor, in the Senate and the streets. The end arrived quietly, and then with ritual. The Queen A.S. apartments were stripped of their ornaments of safety. The lists of loyal households were now liabilities. The lamp in a corner burned low, trimmed by a woman who had learned to keep flame from smoking. Cleopatra sent envoys. Some returned with faces like weathered stone. Others did not return at all. Antony's men saw their commander go quiet, and then ignite. Anger like a lantern raised in wind, fierce, short. The last meeting between queen and general has been painted so often that the paint obscures the wood. What we can say, a door closed, voices lowered. There was perhaps a joke to lighten what could not be lifted. There was mention of children, and of an old hunt, and of wine that had tasted of sunlight on grapes years ago. There was, we hope, gratitude. The ring that had pressed so many seals lay on a table for a moment, its bronze face warm from a hand, and then cooling as bronze does. A letter remained sealed. It would be opened later by someone with less right and more power. Ancient writers gave Antony an end of iron and intention. We do not perform it here. Let us say only that behind a shut door, watched by a few who loved him, and a few who had been paid to watch, he chose not to measure himself by the mercy of enemies. He died as he had lived, aware that dignity in Rome was a garment woven by winners. Cleopatra's end is told with a serpent, a basket of figs, and a poet's flourish, or with bitter oils, or with treated cloth, or with a simple refusal of another's chain. It is disputed. Rumors multiplied in the rooms where her attendants wept. Octavian's writers found the image they needed, a queen felled by exotic means, suitable for moral theater. What matters more than method is the privacy. Both deaths occur beyond public gaze, chosen within rooms where the world was, for once, asked to wait outside. The dynasty did not go with them into the dark entirely. Caesarion's fate was sealed by a cold calculus. What happens to a rival claim when a new order wishes to sleep well? A rumor says a message came, a nod, an order without flourish. Octavian later spoke of mercy as if it were a garment he wore in public, and perhaps he did show it where he could. The younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome to walk in a triumph, small figures beneath heavy jewels, eyes searching for their mother in a crowd that had awaited spectacle and received children. The record after that shows a marriage for Cleopatra Selene, that made her Queen of Mauritania, an attempt at stitching a torn tapestry. Octavian stood in Cleopatra's rooms once, perhaps, and looked at the silver mirror on the table. He was a man of law and opportunity, and he understood, if only in the muscles of his face, that the story he would tell Romans about this room needed to be clean. He kept what served him: the image of a foreign queen, dangerous and undone, the portrait of a rival, Antony, who refused Rome's stern embrace. He put down what did not: the amulet with a child's hair, the fan leaning against a lamp, the key that had opened a chest of letters and now lay without a cord. The purple sail had been taken down and folded. Purple fades in sun. In memory it does not. Years, then centuries, altered every edge. The sea ate the mouths of old harbors and laid them down again. The city rebuilt its outer skin, layer by layer. In the 19th century, divers working where Alexandria meets its ghosts found rings among amphorae in the silt, bronze and gold, some gnawed by salt, some bearing figures. One ring, its face oval and worn, showed a figure who could be Hercules, or simply a man with a club. It sat under lamp glass in a museum on a felt pad the color of olives, labeled Signet, Hellenistic charm Roman, provenance uncertain. The label, cooler than any story, invited 100 whispered ones. It might have been anyone's. That was the point. History is a room where very specific objects stand for many specific hands. In a tomb shifted by floods, archaeologists found a tiny gold cylindrical case with a stopper, a kind of locket used in the Hellenistic East to hold oils or hair. Inside lay a coil of something that could once have been hair, now a dark thread, fragile as breath. The grave goods suggested a woman of rank. Legends sprouted like lilies around a stone. Cleopatra's? An attendant's? A noblewoman's keepsake from a child dead of fever. The record would not commit. It was catalogued as gold amulet case with organic residue, possibly hair. The legend served memory. The record served care. Papyri turned up in dry rooms, a letter in a neat hand, its wax seal softened beyond legibility, the ink borrowed from a scribe's patient well. It listed in neat lines sums paid to oarsmen in the year of Actium and what boats were refitted. No heartbreak, no grand claims. The final line read, "To the Queen, all accounts rendered." Some scholars took it to prove a detail about Cleopatra's direct governance of naval prep. Others saw only a faithful servant's signature. And in a clerk's ledger in Athens, a faded line. Letter lodged for Crete, carried a scratch through it and a note. Stayed by contrary winds. Was it Octavia's? It might be nothing. It might be the absence that made two futures diverge. What of the asp? Poets love it, painters adored it. Ancient writers used it as morality tale, modern ones as symbol of sovereignty shrinking to a point of choice. In the record, there is room for many endings. An asp in a basket, an ointment, a pin's point, a cloth that carried something bitter beneath perfume. Each option serves a teller's need. It is good to leave them all on the table and say, in a room without witnesses, a queen chose her last vocabulary. As for betrayal, did Antony betray Rome? Or did Rome betray the tenderness of one man's heart by defining all loyalty as obedience to its law? Historians dispute. If there is a betrayal no one names, it might be this: the way empire always asks love to kneel, then calls that kneeling a crime. What survives are not only names carved into stone, but careful erasures. Cleopatra's portrait on coins dwindled when new rulers found it useful to pretend she had always been only a stereotype. Antony's reputation was scrubbed and polished to reflect the faces of those who replaced him. Yet when you stand before a case in a museum and see a signet ring with its face worn smooth by years of pressing seals, you feel the residue of decisions. A letter's wax seal, cooling in the dark, has the power to make even modern air seem older. In that cooling lies the nearest thing we have to their breath.